Hi there, I'm Kenneth Smith. I'm a professor of music theory at the University of Liverpool, and I'm going to be presenting 3 short podcasts about my new book, Desire in Chromatic Harmony. The first podcast I'm going to make thinks about tonal function. You may well know that in diatonic harmony there are 3 main functions, the tonic, the subdominant and the dominant, and that these functions work really well together in a kind of relative universe. When we start getting into the chromatic world, there are all sorts of weird and wonderful substitutions that these different chords make, but they still seem to have this energy of the tonic, the subdominant, the dominant and the tonic, and that's what we'll be exploring first today. Okay then, so thinking about tonal function, particularly in chromatic music, I'm going to go back to Hugo Riemann, for whom there were essentially 3 functions: the tonic, the subdominant, the dominant and the tonic. And they work really well in that particular sequence, the tonic, the subdominant, the dominant, then returning to the tonic. Well, why do they work so well together? Well, partly because of the strong 5th motion that goes on in the bass. So from C to F to start with, if we're in C major, tonic to subdominant, and then there is also a 5th motion from G to C, dominant to tonic at the end. Where we're lacking 5th motion is from the subdominant to the dominant. But it still feels quite strong. One of the reasons it feels quite strong, particularly if your name is Jean-Philippe Rameau and you're the 18th century theorist, is that F major chord, or the subdominant, is often substituted by its relative minor. And in fact, for Jean-Philippe Rameau, when you hear that subdominant chord, or F major here, you're also hearing a kind of invisible or inaudible D beneath it, which makes it a 2-7 chord or a D minor 7 chord. Now, whether or not you actually do hear that or even invent it in your mind as you're hearing, it still explains why it's a very common substitution. It's a way of giving you a new variety of that subdominant chord, and it keeps that same level of strength going, so that you can have C to F is a very strong 5th motion, but if that F's got a hidden D beneath it, then D to G is very strong 5th motion, and then G to C is very strong 5th motion. So what you have is a sense of moving around a kind of substitutional version of the cycle of fifths, which explains why that progression, tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, is such a strong one. Now, it's also quite common not only to go C, D minor, G to C, but to do the same with D major and give a modal variant. Okay, so you could use D minor or D7 or F major to represent the subdominant function. You can also use F minor. This was quite common in the Baroque era, when you would often substitute F for F minor but put the A flat in the bass to make a Phrygian cadence. But of course that F minor chord started to evolve into what we call the augmented 6th by raising the F to F sharp. That increases the pull towards the dominant G, and then we move on to C. Now that augmented 6th chord, whether it's a French 6th, a German 6th or an Italian 6th, essentially outlines the sketch of an A flat chord. A flat, C. If it's a German 6th, it's got an E flat in there as well. Instead of the F sharp, we might want to hear that as G flat, in which case it's almost like an A flat 7 chord. In fact, it's got the identical pitch class content to an A flat 7 chord. So we can see how not only are D and F common substitutes for the subdominant, but in a sense A flat is as well, and that becomes quite strong once we start to get into the chromatic era. Now there's one chord missing, in a sense. You may notice that the relationship between those 3 potential substitutes are that they're all related by minor thirds, D, F and A flat. If we carry on up that minor third axis, we would get one more B. Now B is a less common substitute than perhaps the F or the A flat or the D for the subdominant function, but it's still perfectly possible. Here's C major going to F7, going to G to C. I'll now substitute that F7 for a B7. It sounds qualitatively different, but it essentially fulfills the same subdominant function. It leads beautifully to the dominant. Now, in diatonic music, it's quite well established that these 3 functions have very different identities, really. We could categorize the tonic as being a sense of home, the kind of center to which everything draws. We could characterize perhaps the subdominant as being a home away from home, you know, a new area. And the dominant is a strong one because that is an area of yearning to return home. It's like a homesick function. Now, in chromatic harmony, I would suggest that this kind of association that we have with these individual functions becomes quite relative. So if you can imagine that these are 4 different variants of the subdominant function, what we also have, if we extend that logic, are 4 different variants of the dominant function. That works really quite well. If you're a jazz player, you will use tritone substitution all of the time. So instead of going C, F, G7 to C, you might well go C, F, D flat 7 to C. And it has the same function essentially because the tritone within the G7 chord, there's a tritone, the tritone within the G7 chord is also present in the D flat 7 chord. And it still resolves towards C. So it functions in the same way. Now, if you extend this system then to the dominant area, you can also extend it to the tonic area. So we have essentially 3 different collections of chords. Each, in fact, is an octatonic collection. It's as if we're actually moving from one octatonic collection to another one. One of the things that's quite famous about octatonic collections is that they can sound quite sort of stifling. If you are moving between C, A, F sharp and E flat, you don't feel any sense of resolution between there. That's because within an octatonic collection, none of the leading notes that would establish any of those chords as a potential tonic are present. The leading notes are in all of the other different functions. So there is a sense in which these are often described as hovering or static. So my idea about function in chromatic harmony is that we have to relax this idea that the tonic is a sense of home. So if we imagine that there are 4 potential tonics, that's a little bit of a harder pill to swallow. You couldn't, for example, just end a nice, perfectly normal, simple tune by substituting the tonic for its tritone relative. Doesn't really work. Except it kind of does work in the sense that that final C7 to F that we were expecting still resolves some of its tension into B, but that B didn't feel like it was home as such. This is a different type of progression where home is always being projected further around this sort of substitutional rotation. We're going to be looking at music that exemplifies that, and I think one of the best examples is Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, specifically the Prelude, where famously Wagner is trying to embody the sense of yearning. And I'm going to be showing that perhaps the reason that we feel this sense of yearning throughout this Tristan Prelude, but even for the entire opera, which is, as you probably know, lasts for 4 or 5 hours. One of the reasons for this sense of yearning is that we are constantly moving through these 3 different functions, essentially moving through the cycle of fifths in this kind of constant rotary motion. But what we're actually doing is substituting all of the way. Let's see how that works. So this is a graph that shows the different substitutional possibilities, which is shown as minor thirds moving up each column. Working along from left to right, we have the cycle of fifths motion in each of these individual rows. So for example, we can move from C to F to G to C. Or we could still use the tonic subdominant to dominant to tonic progression, and we could substitute the F for an A flat, and we can see how it still has the same progression along the cycle of fifths, just through extra substitutions. Sometimes a composer may well decide that they want to have a D and an F there and kind of move through each individual substitution. What happens there is a sense of resolution of tension from C to F and a resolution from D to G. There is no sense of resolution from F to D because those two are part of the same column. So this prelude is famous for giving you hints of A minor, as if it's quite a strong tonic, but you actually very, very rarely get that A minor chord. It's like an absent tonic. Quite often you'll read analyses of this where people describe how it's a subdominant and a dominant that project that sense of a tonic, and that's certainly true. What I want to explore with this analysis is ways in which that tonic is given, but it's given via one of its substitutions. Now, A minor isn't given particularly strongly at the beginning. If it is A minor, as I've tentatively labelled it on this diagram, it's got this appoggiatura from an A up to an F and then down to E. So it's A minor, or is it A major? It's very, very difficult to say. It's very, very gently and tentatively sketched there. That then moves to this famous Tristan chord. Now there's hundreds, if not thousands, of different interpretations of that chord. One quite common one, particularly common in the Anglo-American world, is that it's actually the chord's resolution upwards to a French sixth that is quite significant about it. When that G sharp rises to the A, we have essentially a French sixth, which you could also think of as an F7 with a diminished fifth. A quality of the French sixth is that it's also identical to itself if you transpose it by a tritone. So if that's an F7 with a diminished fifth, it's also a B7 with a diminished fifth. Now those are both part and parcel of the subdominant function, if this is in A minor. The French sixth would naturally want to move to E7, and that's exactly what happens. The E7 would naturally want to go to A, and that doesn't happen. And I think we know Tristan so well that if we hear that A minor, we just think, what on earth is going on there? We didn't want that. But there is a sense in which that E7 really drives towards A minor, and Wagner leaves that in the air because of it's Tristan. He's trying to tell us that the object of our desire is absolutely unobtainable. There's a gap, there's a rest, a silence. The question is unanswered. The question's answered in a moment by a continuation of E7, with this transposition of the opening motive, now outlining B to G sharp, continuing the E7 across the gap, and then it goes to another Tristan chord, and then a French sixth. That's a D7 with a flattened fifth, and an A flat 7 with a flattened fifth at the same time, because it's a different French sixth. That's the other French sixth from the subdominant axis, if you like. So you'll see on the graph below that this essentially moves across the top of that grid. That D7, or that A flat 7, depending on how you think of it, could well want to go to G7, and that's exactly what happens. G7 should want to move to C, and of course this is Wagner. He doesn't give us that tonic in such an easy way. Instead, across the next space, he gives us, continuing the G7 implication with that rising D up to B, chromatically descends and then gives us a Tristan chord again. Now essentially this doesn't move to a French sixth like the previous interpretations did. This now sticks with this Tristan chord essentially as a D root, so a D half diminished seventh chord. And then it doesn't move on to a dominant. Well, it does, but it moves on to a dominant seventh on B, which is essentially another version of the subdominant function. And this is where it's starting to coagulate. It's starting to keep its energies locked into the same subdominant function. It's repeated, and then it's repeated in a kind of little aphoristic way. Only now does it start to move towards E7. That's where it really wants to go to A minor. That's not what happens. Wagner typically elides that whole situation. He doesn't move us to A minor, he moves us to F with an appoggiatura above it. To some extent there is still that discharge of tension there, of energy, because the pitches of the E7 that want to move to A and C of A minor are still given. We still have those in the F chord. It's only the bass that really stops that from being an A minor triad. So he moves us essentially onto the subdominant function F, kind of still giving us a very, very vague hint of the real tonic, A minor. Here's that cadence again, E7 to F, or is it A minor in our imaginations? In the next phrase, we have this kind of sense of mounting tension, and we have something more like a pure cycle of fifths, as if these substitutions have always worked so well, but now we're starting to move towards a proper object of our tonic desires. So we start to move perhaps more cleanly through more diatonic functions. Here's the first chord that essentially outlines D7. Then the D7 might well want to go to G7, which it does. The G7 might want to go to C7, which it does. That diminished chord there that we finished on essentially is a C7, but with a raised C to C sharp. It could well function like a C7, but remember the diminished seventh chord can function like dominants in 4 different keys, all related octatonically by those minor thirds. So it could function as an A7 as well as a C7. And it does that. It moves to essentially D minor. It's an odd D minor. It's a fairly straightforward chord, but it's slightly ambiguous because it's got a G in it as well, and an F. So I'm kind of seeing that as a D minor chord, but also with an aspect of G7 in there as well. So you'll see on the grid beneath, it kind of moves to both functions, D minor and G, as if they're both put together in one. Now G7 would probably want to go to C. In this case, it doesn't. It goes to E flat, which is another potential representative of the tonic function. If the real tonic is A minor, then C is a one which we've been built towards potentially accepting as an alternative tonic. Again, it was withheld. Now the one we're given is E flat. Then from that E flat, Wagner then switches us to A, which is the true tonic. But it's not a very clear confirming cadence. It's not a very, very strong tonic. In fact, it's very weak because it's arrived at via that tritone switch from E flat to A. And then of course it goes then immediately back to E flat. It moves then on to B7. That's a representative of the subdominant function. It's a B chord initially, but then the 7th comes in the bass. And in that little progression there, we move from B7, which should want to move to E7. We move from B7 to C sharp minor, as if it's a deceptive cadence, but C sharp minor is also a representative of that dominant function, and then it moves to E7, then on to A. So we're now getting the true tonic that we've been wanting to get for these entire, how many is that? It's 25 bars. But again, we arrive at that A through an appoggiatura and on a weak beat. And that A is then immediately undercut by this chord, which is more like an F sharp minor chord. It's very, very sweet. F sharp minor, then moving to the subdominant. Whether this chord is B7 or G sharp 7, still a subdominant function. Then on to E, and then C sharp minor. Now before, a few moments ago, we had C sharp minor where we were expecting E, and then we moved to E. Now we might be expecting C sharp, and we get E, and then we have the C sharp minor. But the C sharp minor then flows into F sharp quite beautifully to now present F sharp as a little bit stronger than that A initially was. Then we move to the subdominant function. So what Wagner does in the entire prelude is keep revolving us through this same cycle of functions, tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, in the same order, but he uses and explores the different substitutional possibilities. This also relates to something I was saying before, which is the sense in which the tonic should be felt as to be a home, and in a sense A minor is supposed to be the home here, but what Wagner actually does is he uses these slightly weaker versions of the home tonic, A minor, or potentially even A major. He uses these slightly weaker versions as alternative tonics, which still serve to essentially discharge the tension of these tonic going to the subdominant, going to the dominant, going to the tonic, but he's not making the tonic feel like it's an exact home. Remember that substitutes are essentially just substitutes. These are secondary versions of the real tonal center. It also makes us reflect, I suppose, on what function is. For me, in this kind of chromatic music, the function of the tonic is really to discharge its energies into the subdominant, not necessarily to feel like an actual home. The function of the subdominant then is potentially to discharge its energies into the dominant again, acting in a slightly different way to how it used to in diatonic music. Perhaps then the function of the dominant is the truest to its original nature, which is to discharge its energies into one of these representatives of the tonic function, preferably the real functional tonic, the A minor in Wagner's case, but often, as we see, through some of these others. Wagner uses these substitutes to keep fanning the flames of our desire for the real one, A minor. So this look at Wagnerian harmony has hopefully shown us a few different ways in which we can move through these different types of functional space, tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, using various different substitutions. Well, there are a few different types of tonal space which can operate within this. So for example, if we had a progression that went C to A flat to E, we might well call that a hexatonic progression, a cycle of major thirds. What this grid shows is that to some degree there is a sense of functional resolution between the three functions as we go from C to A flat to E and then go back to C again. So the function of the dominant can be represented by E going back to C. We might also then want to consider that we could have a progression which moved in terms of rising whole tone progressions, like C to D to E. That progression is a rising whole tone progression which can still have this sense of rising tonal function, moving from tonic to subdominant to dominant to tonic. We could alternatively consider having a progression which moved chromatically downwards, and that would represent again the tonic, subdominant, dominant to tonic. So we could have C going down to B. That's what we had in the initial exploration earlier on today when we talked about the subdominant F being replaced by its tritone substitute B. Then we could have the B being replaced by a B flat, which is in a sense a substitution for the dominant function of G, and then potentially going on downwards. Now, whether or not you could process that as all as tonic, subdominant, dominant, tonic, if it kept moving down chromatically, that might not be the best way of interpreting it. But certainly for short bursts of chromatic chord progressions, that's certainly a plausible way of hearing. So, hopefully that's inspired you to think a little bit deeper perhaps about what function is and how chromatic music can function, or rather how diatonic music can function through chromaticism. One of the issues with functions theory is that it can be somewhat reductive. You're reducing often complicated chords to one of those three functions, the tonic, the subdominant, or the dominant. What I want to explore in the next two videos are different ways of perhaps being a little bit more exploratory about the different ambiguities that each of these individual chords can and does have.